Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Shipwrecks can both grip the imagination and the world's headlines. Some pass into legend and become the basis for movies and books for decades, but other shipwrecks aren't so lucky. They fade into obscurity, forgotten by all but enthusiasts and students of history. Their stories are often equally as tragic as their more famous counterparts, and as you'll see from this list, often they're more so. These are the stories of horrible shipwrecks you may not have heard of. The Cataraqui was the largest loss of life in Australian waters, but the disaster's been largely forgotten to history. The tragedy is made all the more worse because they were only one day away from their intended destination. Cataraqui was a sailing ship, a bark, built in England in 1840. She was absolutely typical of the hundreds, if not thousands of ships of that kind that were sailing to and from Australia at the time. See, in the mid-1800s, Australia was still a relatively new British colony, and the government was keen to establish more of a foothold on the continent. Assisted immigrant schemes were put into place where families seeking to establish a new life away from the grime and muck of England's cities could try their luck in an entirely new continent and society. There were a few downsides though, especially the trip out. The voyage to Australia was really tough, and conditions were nothing short of awful. The ships leaked and rolled violently in the high seas, and passengers not yet used to travelling at sea were sick the entire way. The decks ran thick with vomit, and passenger quarters were cramped and dimly lit. Many sailing immigrant ships simply disappeared in storms, never to be seen again. To sail to Australia was to risk your life. Cataraqui was tiny, only 138 feet or 42 metres long, and 802 tons. But still, in April 1845, into her decks were crowded 369 immigrants and 41 crew. 120 of the hopeful immigrants were married with families, and the ship carried 73 children. In April, she set out from Liverpool, bound for what is today Melbourne, Australia. For months, the ship laboured in rolling seas and high winds, slowly making its way under Africa, then across the Indian Ocean. Conditions were far from perfect. One crewman even fell overboard and was lost. Approaching Australia, the crew were faced with a unique issue. This was well before the days of GPS navigation, radar, or anything like that. Bearings and navigational readings were taken from the sun and stars, and it took competent officers to translate the readings into a position on the ship's charts. After months without seeing land, knowing your exact position was extremely difficult. It's made even harder when the weather is rough or blowing a gale. The crew knew that they were approaching the south coast of Australia and plotted roughly where they thought they might make landfall. Meanwhile, down in the passenger quarters, the two ship's doctors, both brothers named Carpenter, had been hard at work. On the voyage, 5 children had been born and 6 others had died. And such was life in the golden age of sail, when voyages took so long to complete. Cataraqui had left in April, but only began to near the southern coast of Australia in August. On the 3rd, the boisterous weather had grown into a full gale, and the ship was forced to heave to, riding the storm out, not making any progress forward until it had passed. The passengers inside must have been tossed around and frightened witless by the pounding seas and rolling ship, but Cataraqui was designed to survive exactly this kind of treatment. But there was an issue. Conditions had been so bad that Captain C.W. Finlay had not been able to take a navigational reading for 4 days. The ship was being battered around like a cork in a storm, and they had no idea where the shore was. And to hit it would spell absolute disaster. With seas running mountain high and the wind blowing a gale, the ship groped around in the darkness until about 4 a.m. on the morning of August 4th, when there was a terrible crash. Cataraqui had hit a reef off the shore of King Island on the approach to Port Phillip Bay. The captain and crew of Cataraqui had navigated without sighting land for weeks, if not months, to the exact point of making landfall and arriving successfully. They were only 1 day out of their destination, but instead of being able to sight land, they now ran afoul of jagged, razor-sharp rocks, and the ship ground hard, driven into the reef by the thunderous oceans. The hull immediately began to flood, and the passengers panicked. And what unfolded next almost defies description and is best told by one of the few survivors, the ship's chief mate, Guthrie. The scene of confusion and misery that ensued at this awful period, it is almost impossible to describe. All the passengers attempted to rush on deck, and many succeeded in doing so until the ladders were knocked away by the workings of the vessel, when the shrieks from men, women and children from below were terrific, calling on the watch on deck to assist them. The crew were actually mostly up on deck at the time of the collision and immediately got to work. Because the ladders leading up and out of the passenger quarters onto the deck were knocked away, the crew began to tie ropes and haul passengers out bodily, one by one. It was a mammoth effort, but in the end they got a few hundred up on deck. But escaping the flooding hull was one thing. The upper decks offered no shelter from the raging sea. Waves broke over the ship and swept passengers away in their dozens. At 5 AM, just an hour after the grounding, the ship rolled totally onto her port side, with huge waves roaring down the ship's deck and washing away the lifeboats, spars, and even part of the ship's superstructure. The captain, crew, and any remaining passengers held on for dear life, and Captain Finlayson ordered that the masts should be cut away to try to right the vessel. Somehow the crew managed to do it. The masts were all cut off, but despite this heroic effort, the Cataraqui was stuck fast on its side. Passengers caught below in the hull drowned when the ship inevitably filled totally with water. A few hundred people now clung desperately to the side of the ship, exposed totally to the storm. Now, all they could do was try to wait to outlast it. Chief Mate Guthrie recalled, "As the day broke, we found the stern of the vessel washed in, and numerous dead bodies floating around the ship, some banging up on the rocks. Several of the passengers and crew, about 200 altogether, were still holding onto the vessel, the sea breaking over and every wave washing some of them away." Incredibly, they clung on from 5 AM when Cataraqui rolled to 4 in the afternoon, with no hope of escape. To jump into the water would mean almost certain death because the seas were so high that you'd be ground hard into the rocks. Then, in the late afternoon, something horrifying began to happen. Cataraqui had been subjected to unbelievable stresses, withstanding the full force of thunderous ocean waves for hours. With a groan and a crack, the ship began to give way, and then she split in two. Immediately, around 100 survivors were thrown into the waves, and anybody left holding on huddled around on the remaining section of the ship. With the ocean surging around them, they attempted to fashion a buoy to float out to the shoreline, but it became tangled, and it broke up in the seas. Then the ship began to break up beneath their feet, even more, flinging more into the ocean until there was just one section of the ship's bow or front left poking out above the waves, with just 70 people left holding on. Unbelievably, this group clung onto the ship until daybreak the next morning, but when the sun rose, only 30 were left. A party, including one of the Dr. Carpenter brothers, attempted to set off in the only remaining lifeboat, but it was immediately capsized and they were all lost. Then the bow section began to break up, and Cataraqui was finished. With only 20 left holding on for dear life, whatever ropes they'd fashioned to hold them to the wreck were undone to give them a final chance at life. Chief Mate Guthrie grabbed a plank of wood and plunged into the raging ocean. The plank helped carry him over the worst of the rocks, and he was somehow washed up alive on shore. He found another man, a passenger, who'd also miraculously survived, and then a smaller group of frightened, shivering crew. The survivors were tended to by a resident of the island who'd seen chunks of ship floating by and figured there had been a wreck. In the end, the survivors were stranded on the island for 5 weeks while the storm abated and a rescue could be organised. In total, 9 men, 8 crew and 1 passenger survived out of a total complement of 423 souls, and not a single woman or child made it. Rarely is a ship so badly damaged that it sinks in less than 5 minutes. But so it was with the case of one of the Spanish-speaking world's worst losses of life at sea. Principe de Asturias was, for a time, a comfortable and modern passenger liner built in Scotland in 1914 for the Spanish line Naviera Pinillos. The ship was a pretty decent size, at about 460 feet or 140 meters long and around 8,370 tons. The ship provided for first class, second, third, and a fourth immigrant class who were packed into dormitories, all 1,500 of them. Life down there was very different to up in first class, where oak-panelled dining, music, and smoking rooms were supplemented by a library and an ornate, crystal-studded dome. By March 1916, the ship was offering a regular service from Barcelona in Spain to Buenos Aires. Along the way, she'd call at Santos in Sao Paulo, and it was here that she'd meet her doom. The ship was loaded with a cargo of lead, iron, and copper, as well as 20 ornate bronze statues, each weighing more than 800 kilograms, which had been made to commemorate a century of independence. In all, some 588 people boarded for the final leg of the voyage and set off for Santos and Buenos Aires. But there was a problem. See, 6 kilometers or 3.7 miles off the coast of Sao Paulo lies Ilhabela Island, ringed by shoals and reefs which are extremely dangerous to passing ships. It's easy enough to steer clear of the shoreline in good conditions, but on March 5th, 1916, Principe de Asturias' captain had 2 issues to deal with. First, he had to steer closer to shore than he otherwise would. The First World War was raging, and because the ship was carrying a number of German passengers, he was afraid of being intercepted by British warships. That was bad enough, but then, on March 4th, a storm rolled in which shrouded the coastline in fog and driving rain, making visibility almost nil. The result was catastrophic. In the pitch black at around 4 AM on the 5th, Principe de Asturias dragged the full length of her 460-foot hull over a shoal at speed, and she was opened up stem to stern like a tin can. No ship could ever hope to survive this kind of damage. Within seconds, hundreds of tons of water had roared into the ship, immediately submerging the boilers and drowning the crew. The stokers had absolutely no time to close the furnaces or douse the fires. The temperature and pressure differences caused the boilers to explode violently, further damaging the ship and hastening the sinking. After only just having grounded seconds earlier, the Principe's bow had dropped low into the water, and the ship was a goner. The lights immediately cut out as steam pressure was lost and the interior of the rapidly flooding liner was plunged into darkness. Her captain and officers must have been mortified, but their horror didn't last long. After just 5 minutes, the ship had rolled onto her side and sunk beneath the waves, taking 445 people with her. The ship's story passed quickly from newspapers for a couple of reasons. It had happened at the height of the First World War, after the loss of Lusitania and a number of other warships. And not only that, but it happened in the Spanish-speaking world, and there was a degree of indifference from Britain and America. Today, diving on the wreck is extremely difficult, owing to the conditions and visibility. It's usually less than 3 meters. It's thought that even after decades of salvaging efforts, more than half the ship's cargo remains intact, locked firmly in the holds. The 20 bronze statues were a prized target. In 1992, an attempt was made to locate them and the hull was dynamited open, but in the end, only 1 statue could be recovered, and even then it was damaged by the dynamiting. Today it's on display at the Maritime Museum of Rio de Janeiro. The damage to the ship from the grounding was just catastrophic. On the ship's bow alone, today divers have reported a 45-meter or 150-foot long gash. The human cost of the Principe de Asturias is hard to ignore. The decks and compartments of the ship are crowded with human skulls and bones. The worst loss of life in any Australian sinking went almost unrecognised until just this year when the ship's wreck was discovered in 2023. Now, the horrific end of the Montevideo Maru and the poor men trapped inside is a very dark chapter of the Second World War. For those poor victims of the sinking, it was a tragic case of friendly fire. Montevideo Maru was a Japanese combined cargo passenger ship, one of 3 identical sisters designed to operate to South America. She was built in 1926 and was 7,200 gross registered tons, 430 feet, or 130 meters long. Her main destination was Brazil, carrying immigrants and exports, but when the Second World War broke out, the ship was turned over to the Japanese government and repurposed as a troop ship and military transport. In early 1942, the ship took part in the invasion of what is now Indonesia, then the Dutch East Indies, and completed a number of trooping and transport voyages until June that year. On the 22nd, the ship was tasked with picking up 1,054 Allied prisoners. Rabaul had just fallen to the Japanese army, and the mostly Australian and New Zealander garrison had been captured. Loaded full of prisoners of war sweltering down below in the tropical heat, the ship set out unescorted for Hainan, China, but she would never make it. Off the Philippine coast, 5 days later, she was spotted by the US submarine USS Sturgeon. The submarine had no idea that the ship was carrying over 1,000 friendly prisoners in its holds. All they saw in their periscope was an enemy ship. They tailed the Montevideo Maru for some time, unable to fire because she was traveling too fast and they could not get a decent bearing. But then, at midnight, the ship slowed down to just 12 knots as she was ordered to pick up a destroyer escort for the remainder of the voyage. Sturgeon seized the opportunity and fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at the ship at about 2:30 a.m. There was at least one hit. The torpedo slammed home and opened Montevideo Maru's hull up to the ocean. The ship began taking on a huge amount of water and it was obvious she was doomed. The Japanese crew abandoned ship, but the Australian and New Zealander prisoners were left trapped down behind bars. They had virtually no hope for escape as water roared into the doomed ship and around their feet. The Japanese sailors and guards did their best to escape their ship, which was going down by the stern, but their lifeboats flipped and capsized in the chaos. Meanwhile, some small groups of Allied prisoners had somehow broken free and made their way to the upper decks, jumping into the ocean. They swam together in little groups and watched as the ship sank beneath the waves. And they knew that aboard, trapped below, were hundreds of their comrades and friends who had no chance of escape. Japanese survivor Yoshiaka Yamaji was interviewed in 2003 and recalled, "There were more prisoners of war in the water than crew members. The POWs were holding pieces of wood and using bigger pieces as rafts. They were in groups of 20 to 30 people, probably 100 people in all. They were singing songs. I was particularly impressed when they began singing Auld Lang Syne as a tribute to their dead colleagues. And watching that, I learnt that Australians have big hearts." Those groups of POW survivors must have suffered from exposure or shark attack because none ever made it to shore alive. The Montevideo Maru sank in just 11 minutes, and the Japanese crew also had a hard time evacuating their ship. Of the 88 Japanese on board, only 17 survived. Just last month, on April 18th, 2023, the wreck of the Montevideo Maru was found at a depth of over 4 kilometers, or 13,000 feet in the South China Sea, by the Dutch international search specialist organisation Fugro. Cars and trucks that were being transported littered the sea floor. The ship seems to have been ripped into 2 sections, but remarkably, her foremast is still standing upright. No doubt the interior of the ship would reveal horrors of that night, with the remains of those poor trapped servicemen left behind. But out of respect for the families of those who were lost, no artifacts or bones will ever be removed from the wreck. Hospital ships, as their name implies, rely on their striking, bright paint schemes to adequately tell any observing enemy or friendly ships that they are non-combatants and protected under the rules of war. But unfortunately, there are plenty of examples of this being ignored, such as the case with the Centaur, the faithful transport for wounded Allied servicemen that was deliberately sunk by a ruthless enemy. AHS Centaur was an Australian hospital ship that had started life out as a combined passenger cargo vessel built in Scotland. She was small, at 315 feet or 96 metres in length, and only 3,200 gross registered tonnes, but she originally carried plenty of refrigerated cargo between Australia, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. When the Second World War broke out, Centaur was acquired by the Admiralty and was used initially as an armed transport, even rescuing German survivors from the legendary and mutually destructive duel between the German auxiliary cruiser Cormoran and the HMAS Sydney. In 1943, with casualties mounting in the Southeast Pacific, Centaur was converted into a hospital ship with cavernous wards fitted and bright red crosses painted on the hull to deter enemy attacks. Centaur's reason for selection as a hospital ship was her small size. It meant that the ship would be able to access shallow water harbours that other, larger hospital ships couldn't. Her first voyage was a success and she evacuated many wounded, but then, in May 1943, Centaur's good fortune ran out. Centaur set off from Cairns in Queensland, Northern Australia, for a voyage up to New Guinea. She had taken on 74 civilian crew and 53 Australian Medical Corps personnel, as well as 12 nurses from the Australian Army Nursing Service. And supporting them were 192 men of the 212th Field Ambulance Unit, who were specialists at battlefield casualty recovery and treatment. Centaur set off for her intended destination and into the history books. Unbeknownst to Centaur's complement, they were spotted by a Japanese submarine, which had them perfectly in sight. The ship was lit stem to stern with bright lights to show that she was a hospital ship, but the commander of the enemy submarine didn't seem to care. At 4:10 AM, the small ship was shaken violently by an enormous impact as a torpedo exploded against the hull. The warhead had detonated at the exact site of the port fuel tank, sparking a fire that suddenly roared out of control and burned white hot. Many on board were killed by the impact or the fire, but then the ship began to take on a huge volume of water through the 33-foot or 10-meter wide hole left behind by the torpedo. Centaur began to quickly settle in the water, and those aboard only had seconds to act. She began to roll onto her port side, too quick to launch any of the lifeboats, and in just 3 minutes, the Centaur had capsized and sunk into the waves, leaving behind clumps of bewildered, terrified survivors floating alone in the darkness. Fortunately, 2 lifeboats and several rafts broke free in the sinking and bobbed behind, half waterlogged, but enough for the lucky few to cling onto. Many aboard Centaur had been asleep at the time of the attack, and they had no chance of escape. Of 332 people aboard, there were only 64 rescued survivors who had to spend 36 hours in the water. Only one nurse, Sister Ellen Savage, survived the sinking, and in the water she provided medical care and did her best to boost morale, for which she eventually won a medal. At 2 PM on the 15th of May, an American destroyer, the USS Mugford, spotted an object in the distance. An Australian aircraft was able to do a low flypast and report back that there were shipwreck survivors in the water requiring assistance. If not for Mugford being in the right place at the right time, there would have been no survivors from this horrible event. The offending submarine was never conclusively identified, with many operating in the waters that Centaur was lost in. The sinking of Centaur shocked the world and led to an intense feeling of hatred towards the Japanese army from the Australian people and the Western Allies as a whole. It got so bad that the Japanese government issued a statement officially denying responsibility for the attack, although it's thought that the I-777, commanded by Hajime Nakagawa, was the culprit. The submarine commander survived the war and was never prosecuted because Allied investigators could never determine beyond reasonable doubt that it was his sub that had fired the torpedo. Nakagawa, for his part, refused to discuss the subject, even to defend himself. He had a vicious track record though. On 3 separate occasions in 1944, he had ordered the survivors of sunken ships to be machine-gunned in the water, a war crime for which he was tried and sentenced to only 4 years imprisonment after the war. He died in 1991. In 2008, the battered hulk of Centaur was discovered resting on the seafloor by shipwreck hunter and expedition leader David Mearns. The ship is brilliantly preserved, and the hospital markings can still be seen painted on the hull. It's a tragic detail. Beds for wounded soldiers litter the sea floor, but perhaps the most poignant discovery was an iconic Australian Army slouch hat resting on the sand more than 2 kilometers down at the bottom of the ocean. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.